So I'm Lily Maxwell-Lwin. I head up our external communications, advocacy and engagement. And our mission, our vision is a world where all landscapes are renewed so that communities can live in tandem with nature and create regenerative economies that serve them, that serve the planet, for the good of us all. Typically, kind of restoration and conservation projects in the mainstream are short term. They might work for like a 4-year basis, and they're not always looking at holistic outcomes. What holistic landscape restoration does is it looks at the landscape scale and it takes into account people, the community aspect, the social benefit sharing, the economic outcomes, the local communities for economies, the supply chains, and the natural results, returns. So it's different because we're looking holistically, we're looking systemically, and we're taking into account all of those different multi-stakeholder benefits at landscape levels. I think what our landscapes have in common is that in every landscape where we're working, there's a landscape partnership where we're bringing together stakeholders from different sectors, and everybody there is motivated to restore the landscape through this process that we facilitate, we help to run, which brings everyone together into a room to really say, how are we going to work on this? What is our vision for the landscape long term, and how are we going to do it together? And I think that will and that motivation from these like social processes that are carrying out, that's a kind of universal thing about the landscapes where we work. Other than that, we're working across different biomes, right? So in terms of nature, they're very different. So the return of inspiration, what we call the new ROI, what our founder Willem calls it, is the return of hope in a way to communities and people on the ground, to all of us living in landscapes, to keep doing the work we're doing and trying to create a better world from the landscape level up. I think what gives me hope is that return of inspiration, actually, because I think in a lot of projects we're forgetting about the human aspect, the social aspect of our work, whereas that's really the foundation of long-term nature restoration and rewilding. So one thing we've always said is that our framework, the 4 returns framework, which is social, natural, financial return, and the new ROI, return of inspiration, the reason we always say that it's a kind of unique selling point is that it allows people to visualize a landscape, to take a kind of helicopter view and to see where they are within a landscape for the first time, maybe because they haven't considered that perspective before, perhaps. I think that's what mapping does as well. I think you need to be able to picture something on a map, to place yourself on it, and also to understand the whole territory, right? And understand where you're having impact, where you could have more impact, and how you can come together with other stakeholders who have a stake in those different parts of the landscape by really looking at it from a bird's eye view. I think what we're seeing across a lot of industries is a move now towards recognizing that working at landscape level is the most logical way to do things, and also the only way that we're going to have long-term sustainable impact. So we're seeing the word landscape come up a lot in the recent, for example, IPBES recently released a Nexus report where they're talking about landscape level stuff. We're seeing businesses taking into account supply sheds, more or less landscape level, in their value chain decarbonization. So I think landscape in general is becoming more of a thing in the sort of climate and nature space. I think what we're seeing and what we've been seeing for a few years, right, is this discussion of the need to bring together climate, nature, and land. And we've seen here at ChangeNOW, there was a conversation about the synergies between the 3 COPs yesterday, but there isn't still a concrete sense of how we're really going to bring those 3 things together and understand that what we're working on is a holistic nature issue and our own connection to the nature that we're part of, rather than a climate issue and this sort of abstract, global, atmospheric level. So I think in the restoration space, what we're seeing is a move towards holistic approaches, because the restoration space itself, right, is a very unique space. We're seeing more and more research and more recognition that holistic landscape restoration, sometimes referred to as integrated land management, also is really the way you're going to have to do it, because unless you have local communities governing how this process is done and having a stake in it and being able to lead from the ground up and feel and have their voice listened to, you won't get results long term. So I think local community governance, I think holistic and systemic approaches, like linking this up with systems change, and I think bringing the private sector in, and I think there's more and more interest from banking and insurance. There's more and more interest, obviously, from especially here in Europe. America maybe is slightly different. We'll talk about that later. But Europe, the corporate sector knows that they have to report on these things. They know they have to do it. There is a will. And the banking and insurance sector is, of course, incredibly worried, I think, right now about the risk side of things. Recently we saw the CEO of Allianz talking about the fall of capitalism if the insurance industry can't do its job anymore because of climate change. So I think we're seeing that private sector side kind of coming in and showing more interest, but the practical reality of how we're going to work together in those partnerships, I think is still sort of to be figured out. But yeah, I think those three things. Yeah, I think my call to action would be actually, I guess, both a call to action and a question. So my call to action to people out there would be, think about the landscape that you're in. Remember that land is as much a part of climate change, land use change, as emissions. And I think we need to really pivot towards recognizing that we all live in landscapes. And sometimes you can feel powerless because you think, how am I going to stop using my car or stop eating feet necessarily? But if you just look at where you are, look around you, get a map, figure out what watershed you're in, what is your local river? What ecosystem are you part of? It sounds difficult, but you can just Google, what watershed am I in? And go from the local level, have conversations with people locally about that. Do you know you're in the peat meadow landscape right now? We're in an ecosystem. So my call to action would be, think about the land piece, look into that, and engage with the nature that you're part of, even if it means planting a seed in a tiny pot on your windowsill, just to get a sense of how plants work. Or to having conversations with people about climate change and about land. My question would be to everyone out there, how do we make land sexy? Like climate changes, because I think that the climate change movement has done well to get everybody on board with the notion of climate change, and what we haven't done yet is to raise awareness of land degradation to the same extent and make people understand that land and climate interaction that's so vital to us tackling both climate change and biodiversity loss and all of the natural system degradation that we're facing. I think I would say the same thing, which is let's work on land together. Let's remember that two-legged problem of climate change, one leg being climate and the other one being land use change. And if we don't tackle that land use side, we can reduce emissions to zero and we can stop the fossil fuel industry, but we're not going to save humanity, not to be doomery, but unless we look at what we're doing to ecosystems, to nature on the ground. Because if all the insects die, or if all the trees, we're still facing the same issue. So we need the energy transition. Of course, we need to lower emissions and decarbonize all of our economies. That's absolutely essential. But equally essential to that is dealing with land degradation, restoring ecosystems, both on the urban scale and in the rural scale, transitioning the agricultural sector as fast as we possibly can. And unless we're putting as much effort into that, we're going to fail, even if we transition completely to a green energy world. Yeah. So let's really talk about land and think about and landscapes, and think about how we're all going to work with local communities where we live. Don't see this as a high-level abstract problem that you're jumping in with your company to a place outside where you are to help them because they need help. No, you live in a landscape. Your landscape probably is degraded in some way. We all have a role to play in finding out about that, working with our local council, with our community, and trying to make change.